Hi guys, it's Jessica. This is a new house in a new location. I'm working on getting it set up for recording, but it's not quite 100% yet. Today I want to talk about The Last Duel, why it failed in the box office, and whether or not a story told this way was destined to fail from the start. Now, The Last Duel is kind of old news. It released on October 15th and was a box office failure. It's available on streaming, on Blu-ray, and DVD as of November 22nd. So everyone can now pay to see it on demand whenever they would like. I don't believe it's streaming anywhere for free. And just so we're all on the same page, IMDb summarizes this as King Charles IV declares Knight Jean de Carrage settle his dispute with his squire by challenging him to a duel. This is a pretty vague summary, and for me personally, I find it bland and uninteresting. What appeals to me about The Last Duel is that it was directed by Ridley Scott, and it was a screenplay that was done by Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, and the story itself is actually told in 3 chapters, one from alternating perspectives. So we get Carrage / the husband's perspective, we get the squire's perspective, and then we get the wife's perspective. And then the last thing that interests me about this story is it's based on a true story, and it's based on a fairly successful novel also called The Last Duel. Before we go forward, IMDb also obscures a central topic of The Last Duel, and I'm going to have to give trigger warnings here. The Last Duel takes place between Carrage and the squire because they're arguing about whether or not an assault on Carrage's wife happened. And there's really no way to talk about the movie The Last Duel, the events of The Last Duel, without talking about SA and rape. I'm doing my best in this video not to be too explicit about the assault elements that are within The Last Duel, but we will have to talk about them a little bit. First, how they're presented, why they're in the film, and some elements surrounding them that might also be triggering. It's not just the depiction of the assault itself that I think is problematic. I also think the trial and how those trials relate to modern days could be problematic as well. So if you're sensitive to these kind of topics, this is probably not the video for you. In and of itself, the failure of The Last Duel is pretty notable because it does have so many big names attached to it. But on top of that, Ridley Scott got onto a podcast and actually discussed why he felt The Last Duel had failed, and it caused a lot of stir right before the movie released to streaming. He said,
I think what it boils down to, what we've got today, are the audiences who were brought up on these fucking cell phones. The millennials do not ever want to be taught anything unless they are told it on a cell phone. This is the broad stroke, but I think we're dealing it right now with Facebook. There's a misdirection that happened where it's given the wrong kind of confidence to this latest generation, I think.
Scott's criticism got a lot of traction in entertainment news because millennials can't help but responding when someone criticizes them. Part of my interest in doing this video was actually originally to address this particular point in Scott's complaints about millennials, but then I really stopped and thought about it, and I think that Scott blaming millennials is not actually something he thinks or believes in truth. Part of the reason I feel this way is because Ridley Scott had originally partnered with the now defunct streaming service Quibi to do a science fiction show that never ended up coming about. So he has no issue with cell phones or millennials in theory. He understands that media and its potential appeals. So I think this was all a targeted marketing move to get his movie's name out in the ether while it was releasing the Blu-ray and DVD. Now that we've debunked Ridley Scott's statement and whether or not he actually meant it, I want to go ahead, dig in a little bit more to The Last Duel, and figure out who the audience for this movie was and why we weren't able to reach them. When you want to share a story, whether it's a book or a movie, you should always be thinking, who will see this story? For The Last Duel, presumably the screenplay writer had to pitch the story and the audience to their producers when they were trying to get it made. I'd have pitched that The Last Duel is based off of a moderately successful book, so there's a built-in audience for it. I'd have mentioned The Last Duel is based on a true story, and people eat that up at the theater. I'd have stressed that The Last Duel would be an epic historic drama. That genre is perennial, which means once the movie is created, marketed, we could drop it into almost any season and get a reasonable draw. It's not a summertime or a Christmas time movie, and it's not something that's trending right now, so I wouldn't be relying on finishing it at a trending time. This is my 2015 pitch, by the way, which is when The Last Duel originally was pitched to a producer. If I were going to pitch The Last Duel in a 2021 scenario as opposed to a 2015 scenario, I might actually point to the success of things like Bridgerton, Shadow and Bone, and the interest in the upcoming Lord of the Rings TV show to show that these medieval period pieces actually have captured a lot of the audience's interest. The Last Duel doesn't have a sorcery element. It does have like this sword fighting epic feel that might attract the same audience from a Shadow and Bone or a Lord of the Rings. Probably pitch that The Last Duel is a very flexible story. You could pitch it as a character-driven drama, which is something that we see in Ridley Scott's version, but it also could be more epic and action-based. We could have focused on crusades and the actual fight of the duel. And I think if I were pitching in 2015, based off of kind of Hollywood marketers, I'd have probably stressed the action-oriented element, because it looks to me like a lot of Robin Hood and King Arthur movies get made every year, and they're never successful, but they're always funded. This whole medieval bow and arrow, jousting, sword fighting thing, for whatever reason, interests producers even when they have trouble finding success with audiences. The 2015 pitch that was made to the producers got them to buy rights to The Last Duel, but it didn't actually result in them producing a movie. Now, why a producer might have bought rights to something and then let it lapse is a touchy subject. It could have just been an honest-to-goodness scheduling issue. They might not have ever had the time to make this movie, or they might not have ever been able to gather all the people they needed. It could have been an extra rights that they bought. There's no urgency to produce this film. The producers were able to buy a lot of good rights, and they were busy with time-sensitive stories. Or it could be that in 2016, with the election of Donald Trump here in the USA, suddenly women's issues became a lot more of a hot topic. Both Donald Trump's election to the White House and the Me Too movement became really strong. How we started talking about SA and believing women, what happens when people in positions of power abuse their power, that whole conversation became a lot louder. The dynamics in it changed drastically. So filming a movie where the central conflict is about whether or not a woman was assaulted just might not have been as financially safe anymore as it had seemed in early 2015. And I do think that the producer who originally bought the rights let them lapse, at least in part because of the content in The Last Duel. Because in 2019, Ridley Scott bought the rights. He, Matt Damon, and Ben Affleck partnered up to make this movie happen. And suddenly there was funding and forward motion on creating The Last Duel. Now, it's possible that they were just more passionate about the topic than anyone previously was, but I think part of the reason they got the funding and the green light to go ahead and make this movie is because all of them are really big name people within the industry, and other people in the area felt that their big names could help overcome some of the stigma of the actual content within The Last Duel. It's also worth noting that when they started casting, they casted a few other big name actors as well. Adam Driver plays the squire, and Jody Comer is the wife. And while Jody Comer is probably the smallest of the three main actors, she's recently done quite a few things that have got her some attention. The first main hurdle for The Last Duel getting an audience in theaters is going to be the COVID-19 pandemic. People are less likely to go in theaters to see a movie, regardless of what that movie is right now. And this drastically changes your potential demographic for the film, because the people who are still going into theaters are going to be Generation Z, millennials, and maybe some of the young Generation X people. And as we've already discussed in The Last Duel, a main topic of conversation is essay. And because of that, it actually cuts out a large group of Gen Z as well. Probably half of Generation Z is too young to see this movie. It really suddenly became a movie that was riding on millennials being interested in seeing it to succeed. I should also mention that even if the pandemic hadn't been a thing, when this movie came out would always have been crucial to its success. The Last Duel isn't a movie that people are going to see because they're super stoked to see The Last Duel. They're not going because they just can't get enough medieval France lore. Most of them are going to be going because it's Ridley Scott's latest movie and it's got a screenplay by Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. And oh, there's all this star power and interesting filming going on. So it's really like a film buff fan base kind of thing. If that's competing with something that's also got a lot of popular actors and popular directors, that has a large fan base or has a great story, or that people have been waiting for years to come out, then it's not going to do well in the box office. And because 2020 was such a terrible year for movies, a lot of them got pushed to 2021. The Last Duel was competing against many movies people had waited a year to see. It released with Halloween Kills, and the following week, Dune released. And I think a lot of people who were into artsy filming went to go see Dune instead of The Last Duel. I think Halloween Kills is something that people chose to see in theaters over The Last Duel. And I think the fact that The Last Duel wasn't available on streaming also hurt it. Even in the most normal and ideal situations, The Last Duel would have always had what I like to call a content issue. Essay and harassment shown on screen has a long and checkered history. It's often filmed in a way to titillate viewers instead of horrify them or to show the brutality of the act. So when people know that Essay is involved in a movie, they have to weigh whether or not they want to risk seeing it portrayed badly on screen. And it's not actually unreasonable to think that the Essay might be portrayed badly in The Last Duel. After all, the central conflict is about whether or not the wife was assaulted. So filming it in a way that's ambiguous increases narrative tension. It's not ethically right, but I can see storytelling-wise why you might film the assault in a way that leaves an open question. But let's go ahead and assume that The Last Duel shows the Essay in a way that's brutal and horrifying. We have to watch that assault twice on screen. And I don't think many people are interested in watching that. According to RAND, 1 out of 6 American women and 1 out of 33 American men have been victim of an attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. So that means that there's an overwhelming amount of people who are affected by assault and who may feel very sensitively about how it's portrayed on screen. They might not want to watch that for entertainment. And even if they're one of the people who either doesn't have experience with it or who feels it's important to watch the movie regardless, they're going to have a hard time finding a friend or family member to go with them. The Last Duel is not exactly date night material. Beyond that, I think how they framed the assault in general is not innovative and not as feminist as they believe. The title of the movie itself implies the movie is about the duel that happens. Or in other words, it's about two men fighting about what did or didn't happen to the woman. It doesn't center the narrative of what happened from the woman's point of view. We're still talking about assault in a way where men or family members are reacting and responding or exploring that instead of exploring the point of view of the victim. It's just another example of a man-centered story where something terrible happens to a woman so men can react. And within storytelling, this is historically how rape is used. It's framed as a tool to create character development by bystanders, not to talk about what happened to the victim or to talk about the mindset of the attacker. In a lot of ways, I'm not sure what makes The Last Duel stand out from other movies like Mandy, where Nicolas Cage's character finds that his partner has been assaulted and murdered, and then he goes on a revenge spree on her behalf. Or Taken, where Liam Neeson's daughter is kidnapped into trafficking and he goes on a murder spree to get her free. Or even something like The Dark Knight, where Katie Holmes' death is used as the reason that Harvey Dent becomes Two-Face and Batman becomes extra broody. Scott protests that The Last Duel teaches you something. But honestly, there's a million movies that handle this subject matter from a male perspective, from the idea that the woman is a prop to spur male character development or to create a man-written history. And I just don't see how The Last Duel stands out against any of these other movies. movies. Something you guys may not have known is that The Last Duel was definitely advertised and marketed to me. As someone who's a big fan of Ridley Scott's work, I actually was paying a lot of attention to the reviews and critiques that did come in. And one of the things that I heard people bring up as a comment all the time that they learned from the movie were all these weird, old-timey rape myths. For example, it can't be true rape if a child is conceived because for a child to be conceived, women have to have found some kind of pleasure in the act, which we know today, of course, is scientifically untrue. But I just found it interesting that so many of these reviewers had never heard that myth today, because it's not an old-timey stereotype from a bygone past. As recently as 2012, this myth has been brought forward front and stage as a USA talking point regarding whether or not we need access to abortion, because true rape can only happen if a woman did not consent. And if there's a baby, then somehow the woman found some kind of way to consent or enjoy the act. This is gross, it's wrong, and it's disgusting. But at the same time, it's not something we've abandoned. It shouldn't have been a new revelation to anyone who has to pay attention to these kind of topics. The whole trial aspect of The Last Duel is not as removed as you would think. Rape is one of the most underreported crimes in the US. And when it is reported, rape kits just sits for years and years and years on end without anyone attempting to find the perpetrators of these crimes. And when these people are brought to trial, which is rarely, because people usually settle outside of court when a perpetrator can even be found, these court cases, the victim has to stand and have their entire life picked apart. They have to listen to all the same kind of arguments that were going on back in the day in medieval France. We have not progressed to a point where we have the distance of history to appreciate this moment in The Last Duel. Perhaps the only notable difference is that the medieval France court case came about because Courage's property had been damaged, where modern day rape cases come about as an actual assault to a victim. Just because this is a history drama doesn't mean that most people have the benefit of distance from the main subject matter. Disbelieving victims, skewing the case in favor of those with money and power, and people either disbelieving or not collecting evidence are all prevalent in our modern day justice system when trying to tackle sexual assault and rape cases. Brock Turner was literally found behind a dumpster assaulting a girl. He was found guilty of 3 felony assaults. The prosecution was asking for 6 years. The judge gave Brock Turner 6 months. And when he gave his sentencing, the judge used Brock Turner's good character and the fact that this incident would affect him for the rest of his life as the reasoning behind such a light sentence. The attacker who had a higher priority than the victim. The issues we see in The Last Duel are not something that we can look at and pat ourselves in the back on because we've done better. And because it's framed as something that you might learn from as a long gone history, I think it turns away a lot of the core feminist audience that The Last Duel might have been looking to get. I do think from Ridley Scott's perspective, and probably many of the main contributors to The Last Duel, they feel that they did everything right in telling this as a feminist story, which is why Ridley Scott and others believe that neither the marketing nor the content is what's at fault for the box office failure of The Last Duel. And to their credit, both Matt Damon and Ben Affleck felt that they couldn't do justice to Marguerite's story on their own, and they went and they got a woman's perspective. Nicole Holzapfenner helps with the screenplay, and she writes all of Marguerite's part. Both Affleck and Damon acknowledged that their screenplay was more historic research and getting the history and the theatrics right there, while Nicole had a larger job. She had to actually whole cloth make up a lot of Marguerite's part, including a woman writer. For any reason, but especially to provide the female perspective is awesome. But I do think Nicole Holzapfenner had a much larger task on hand than maybe she was prepared to take on. First of all, it's never any fun to be the monolithic female voice in the room. There's a lot of pressure now on her to provide the correct women's perspective, whatever that is. And whatever she's doing, she's going to have to make fit with whatever Matt Damon and Ben Affleck have done. So even if she was perfect to give a female perspective, her perspective is contained by making it match what already exists. And the other thing I have to wonder is whether Nicole was given the opportunity to look at historic information about women in medieval France. I know there's not a lot about Marguerite specifically, but we do have journals from upper class women in medieval France at this time that would have given us a little window into how these women generally lived their lives, what their responsibilities were, what kind of social interactions they had. I did look at several interviews done by her to see if she had any of this information or if she just had to go ahead and make it up, and I couldn't find that out. But given both Matt Damon's and Ben Affleck's statements that she whole cloth made up Marguerite's point, I have to feel like they didn't really do their due diligence, and this movie isn't anywhere near as educational as Ridley Scott would have you believe. At least it's not teaching us much of anything from a women's perspective. The marketing release of The Last Duel includes a lot of interviews with Jody Comer, and it asks her a lot of questions that I think were meant to imply there was a thoughtful feminist lens involved in this movie. And I think it was also supposed to imply that Jody Comer was very passionate about the movie. At least I think that's what the goal of the marketing material was, but it seems like no one talked to Jody Comer about what she was supposed to say or how she was supposed to say it, because it often comes off like she's not prepped for the kind of questions interviewers are asking her. When she's asked why she chose to play Marguerite, she talks about how flattered she was to be in a Ridley Scott movie and get a chance to act with Matt Damon and to bring a script to life that Matt Damon and Ben Affleck had written together. It doesn't show that she's passionate about the subject matter or that she felt the subject matter was handled well. In fact, Comer sort of neatly sidesteps the open question of whether or not The Last Duel is a good movie or is saying anything of value at all from a female perspective. I think Comer makes a good response for herself. The issue is I think what they wanted from her was something more affirming about the movie as a whole. And I just want to stress that right there because it's not really Comer's responsibility to put a rubber stamp and say that this is a feminist movie or this movie is good for women. She's asked so many times about the subject matter, about why she did the movie, about whether or not she felt passionately about the movie, that people were digging, looking for her to approve the movie. And good for her that she never does, but at the same time, if you were looking for that response for her to help validate the quality of this movie, it never comes out in her interviews. And it's kind of weird the marketing team continued to push them like it would be affirming. Comer also talks a lot about the filming of the assault scenes, and she says the first time that the scene was filmed, Ridley Scott actually stopped production, had everyone leave the room, and spent some time talking to her one-on-one about what had just happened and how she felt and helped her process it, which is great. And also Comer mentions that there were mental health experts on hand for everyone involved in the filming. So if anything came up, they could discuss it and process it in their own time, which again is great. Further, when looking into how they decided to film the assault scenes in this movie, I saw that Ridley Scott and his team had talked to RAND, which is the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, so that they could figure out what hallmarks would accurately depict the scene and would help make it clear to audiences exactly what was happening in that scene. So I do want to acknowledge The Last Duel strove to be as accurate to an assault case as possible. This is all the bare minimum, basic stuff you should be doing. You don't get an award or a gold star for it. You don't get to say that your thing is feminist just because you followed what the reality on the ground is. Things that would have taken The Last Duel and brought it to the next level, the marketing campaign in The Last Duel had actually taken this time to discuss what some of the red flags or key alerts are to abuse and assault. They could have talked about what RAND advised them on when filming. Like, when you see things like this, you know this is assault, or you know there's no consent. But that's not really what they did. They did the bare minimum, and then they tried to get themselves a pat on the back for it and gain an audience from it. I'm not confident that Matt Damon or Ben Affleck knew what they were writing or how to write it. They had this spark of what I would consider an interesting idea, paralleling Marguerite's story to the Me Too movement, but I don't think what we see actually does that well. One way we could have done this is if we had flash between the two footages, like if we'd seen The Last Duel and then we projected forward and seen some of the Me Too movement, or if we had changed the name from The Last Duel to something else and centered the story on Marguerite's experience, maybe her day-to-day life, how she processed this trauma, how this trauma affected her, instead of centering the main story on these men arguing about what happened and then eventually fighting to the death about it. And I don't know that Ridley Scott had any idea what he was doing in directing or producing this movie. And it's a little bit surprising because he has what I would consider decent feminist collection of work. This includes both Alien and G.I. Jane. And these two movies are feminist in different ways. With Alien, what's feminist about it is the main surviving character is a woman, and she's just treated like a normal human being with a normal personality. You know, there's nothing specifically feminine or masculine about her. And G.I. Jane is a feminist work because it's about a woman joining the army and going through basic boot camp and overcoming common stereotypes. Both Alien and G.I. Jane are older movies, and they come from a time when having a woman be the lead in a movie or having the woman show non-stereotype female characteristics was where the bar was at to be a feminist progressive movie. But we're farther than that now. We have female characters who kick ass on screen and in books all the time. And I love them. They're great. But that doesn't make the movie or show feminist anymore. Feminist movies have always been about breaking new ground and shedding new light on what the female perspective might be like. Back in the day, that was showing women being treated as equals to men. I feel like that is sort of a base standard now. Acknowledging that rape is bad and that we should believe victims is no longer new ground on this topic. While I was completing research for this script, I learned a lot about the history of The Last Duel and how Voltaire and some of his contemporaries used this duel as a prop for their atheist agenda. And at that point in time, they were claiming that the squire who was murdered in the duel was actually a victim to God belief. And I think that's the point that's missed the most here in The Last Duel. It's been used historically as a prop. First, Marguerite's story was a prop for The Last Duel. Later, it became a prop for atheists to fight against God belief. And now it's just a prop as part of this parallel women speak out against power, Me Too movement kind of thing. We're still not hearing or listening to Marguerite's story. We're still not searching for the truth or attempting to uncover more about women in history. It's another case where history is written by the victors. Guilt or innocence is decided by the current sentiment of the day. And I think that's part of what's really missing in this Last Duel movie. Who we believe and why we believe them changes as time goes on. And that could have been a really interesting and thoughtful moment to cap this movie off. Instead, we're here going over rote tropes, pretending it's innovative and new, and pretending that posturing next to someone is the same as actually allying with them or helping them. This was a really long script to write and even longer to record. Thanks for bearing with me. It's my first dive into something this weighty and trying to give it the proper amount of research and perspective. If you liked it, can you please leave a thumbs up so I know if this is worth my time to keep doing? And if you didn't like it, feel free to leave a thumbs down or mention it in a comment down below. Did you see The Last Duel? And if you did, what did you think of it? Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye!